Hello, and welcome back to the channel. With the Duviri Paradox launching just over a year ago, I thought it'd be a good time to discuss it and have a look at where it is today. And today, I think it's in a less than ideal place. It was pretty fun on launch, but having played all it has to offer, and with the new content novelty wearing off, there's not much reason to return. It's become repetitive, and not the kind of repetitive you want in a roguelite, and so it's pretty boring as a result. Let's talk about why this is the case, and some ways in which Duviri could be improved to make it an overall more enjoyable expansion. Most of this video will be dedicated to discussing Duviri's gameplay, but I'll briefly touch on its lore and narrative afterwards. Before we begin, there will be spoilers, so if you're not up to date with the story of Warframe, please click off. With that being said, let's explore why Duviri is flawed, starting off by talking about the quest. The main problem with Duviri's quest is that it prioritizes gameplay over actual storytelling. The majority of the quest time is dedicated to playing shorter spirals, which isn't really ideal. It means that the quest doesn't stick out as a memorable experience because it's almost identical to regular Duviri gameplay. That's usually the best thing about Warframe quests. They give you a unique story experience you won't find anywhere else in the game. With the protagonist as interesting as the Drifter too, it's a shame we hardly explore their backstory beyond a couple of flashbacks and monologues. The second problem with the quest is its placement in the overall Warframe questline. Towards the back end of development, DE decided to have the Duviri Paradox act as an alternate beginning to Warframe. Because of this, the quest itself includes a tutorial for Warframe as a whole. This shouldn't really be here, because Duviri shouldn't really be here as an alternate start to the game. I understand wanting content for new players to jump straight into, but the focus should be on improving the current new player experience, not replacing it entirely. Duviri better belong somewhere in between the War Within and the New War, or somewhere after the New War. Next, let's talk about Drifter Intrinsics, which I think are one of the biggest drawbacks of Duviri. This section will be one of the biggest parts of the video, so let's get right into it. I'm going to use the combat intrinsics to also discuss Duviri melee combat overall. My main problem with the combat intrinsics is that outside of a handful of them, they feel pretty inconsequential. Buffs like 20% critical chance and cooldown reductions hardly, if at all, contribute to the gameplay experience. With all these combat intrinsics being pretty insignificant, there's an incredible opportunity for improvement. The first opportunity lies in the power strike bar, which for convenience I'll shorten to PSB. The PSB is a bar that depletes whenever the Drifter performs a power strike, and it recharges over time. I feel that this could be utilized further. My idea is that heavy attacks could also deplete the PSB. Hear me out here. By default, a heavy attack would deplete 1/3 of the PSB, allowing you to perform 3 in succession before it needs to recharge. This means that you'd have to choose between heavy attacks and power strikes in any given encounter. It'd add a layer of depth to the combat, make decree choice more important, and creates an opportunity for an impactful intrinsic. This intrinsic could be to make heavy attacks deplete only 1/6 of the PSB, allowing you to perform twice as many heavy attacks in succession. Compared to something like 25% more damage, this would make a much bigger difference in combat. My second major improvement for combat intrinsics and melee combat has to do with the combos. For whatever reason, Drifters only have a standard attack combo with the Duviri melee weapons. What makes this even weirder is that these same weapons do have the second and third combos when wielded by Warframes. Drifters don't seem to be able to slam attack either. Intrinsics grant mastery, so it's only fitting that acquiring these intrinsics represent the Drifter's mastery of melee combat itself. One other change that isn't as important would be to add a few more finisher animations. It wouldn't change much, but it does kind of get old seeing the exact same finisher animations over and over and over again. The riding intrinsics are probably the worst offender, but that brings the most opportunity for improvement. The biggest issue is definitely in the Kaith abilities, Hoof Stomp and Steadfast Dismount. Hoof Stomp is cool conceptually, but in practice, it's pretty weak. The damage is really low, and the slow effect lasts for half the time it actually takes to dismount. I think an easy fix around this would simply be letting the damage scale with the Deadly Decrees intrinsic, like the Drifter does. Increasing the duration of the slow would help too. Steadfast Dismount, however, isn't really as cool as Hoof Stomp. If you have the stable stance decree, the overguard is about as effective as 150 more health. Given how much health decrees give you already, this really isn't necessary. A similar and better ability could be a rapid forward charge that knocks enemies down and deals high damage with a modest range. An offensive ability like this would further incentivize Kaith-back combat, considering they don't get much use in combat right now. Which leads me to my next suggestion. We should be able to melee attack while riding Kaiths. Again, Duviri is very melee focused, so it seems like an obvious addition to the Drifter's kit. It would serve as the perfect replacement to Unique Identity, which shouldn't even really be a decree at all. It hardly does anything anyway, you don't see it outside of 2 text fields. Given the fact that we fight a mounted melee Dax, and that the original Duviri trailer featured this, it's a shame we don't have it as players. A quality of life improvement could be to reconfigure controls so that Hoof Stomp and Forward Charge are performed with the same controls as a Slam attack and Block attack respectively. What this means is keys 1 to 4 are free for Warframes and the Drifter to use all of their abilities, or at least those that are applicable. My final point about riding Intrinsics and the Kaith has to do with actually riding the Kaith itself. If you've ever played Duviri, you know about the Fleet-Footed decree, which grants 10% movement speed for each decree you've acquired in the current spiral. At a point, the speed boost is so strong that riding and even flying with the Kaith is way slower. I think this is an issue. It completely removes the need to ever use your Kaith to get around Duviri. There are a couple of improvements that would help to fix this. In fact, introducing both would be best. The first is to let the Kaith be affected by Fleet-Footed, perhaps only at 5% per stack instead of 10%, considering Kaiths are inherently faster than the Drifters. The second is to give the Kaith a gallop where the Drifter holsters their weapons and focuses on riding. This gallop would have much more speed at the cost of some maneuverability. It'd help to give the Kaith a bit more purpose as a mode of transportation. Once again, this would fit perfectly as a replacement to one of the multiple insignificant riding intrinsics. I don't actually have much to say about the opportunity intrinsics, they certainly have a big enough impact on gameplay as they are. The only gripe I could really mention is that you only get a choice of 2 secondaries as opposed to 3 like primaries and melees, but that's really just a nitpick. The lineup for endurance intrinsics is actually pretty strong. Most of them have a significant impact on Duviri gameplay, but there's 2 that really irk me. They are determination and tenacity. Both of these grant an additional revive in Duviri, going from a total of 6 to 8. These intrinsics are completely useless. Duviri is way too easy to justify even having revives to begin with. Toward the end of the spiral, you effectively have to try to die. This issue ties into a major piece of content that was cut since the TennoCon 2022 Duviri demo, Matoliths. Matoliths served as checkpoints that you'd use the guiding hand to activate. When the Drifter died, they would respawn at the most recently activated Matolith. This was a really interesting idea that hadn't been seen in Warframe before, but unfortunately it never made the final version of Duviri. I think these could definitely be brought back. Instead of prompting revival, have Drifters die instantly, be greeted by Thrax like in the demo, and have them respawn at their nearest activated Matolith. It'd make death at least a little bit more meaningful, and create some incentive for players to win their fights. One gripe I have with the remaining endurance intrinsics is that they might just be a bit too strong. The Drifter really doesn't need thousands of health while fighting Dax, especially in Steel Path where things are meant to be difficult. Toning down the effectiveness of these intrinsics is an easy solution. Again, this would help make fights feel more rewarding. Next, let's talk about the Drifter's abilities, specifically Guiding Hand and Smoke Screen. The Guiding Hand was originally going to be a weapon for the Drifter, but was replaced with the Sirocco and so moved to being an ability. And as an ability, it's pretty useless. It might have served some purpose as a guide to the main objective if, there wasn't a waypoint already. The Neural Pulse combat intrinsic allows the Guiding Hand to highlight weak spots on enemies to deal increased damage. I feel like this is pretty unreliable. I never really know when the 3 times damage has actually worked or not. And again, more damage is the last thing the Drifter needs, especially later on in the spiral when you're stacked with decrees. An easy and effective solution could be to just make enemies inside the radius more vulnerable to damage overall without having to rely on weak spots. The guiding hand could also be changed to blind enemies in its radius, opening them to finishes. Something like this could open up some stealth avenues for gameplay. Also, I'm not sure if this is a bug, but when you use guiding hand, the camera will be pushed back before slowly pulling back in. This didn't happen in the demo, nor does it really help to see the guiding light, so I'm not sure why this is a thing. This ability was ported directly from the Drifter's New War kit, and for some reason had both its range and duration decreased. This feels like the salt in the wound that is Duviri not having stealth. For some reason, you can't at all sneak up on enemies, they'll just magically spot you from behind them. Even if you can get behind them, the Drifter can't stealth attack, so it's pointless anyway. The only use case I've really seen is when you need space to revive a teammate. I think reverting the nerfs, allowing stealth finishes, and the aforementioned guiding hand changes would reopen stealth as a playstyle in Duviri. After all, stealth was the focus of the Drifter in the New War. Let's move on to discuss Duviri's gameplay loop on a broader level. My first point is about the Undercroft, specifically its presence in Duviri's spirals. They shouldn't be. I enjoy the Undercroft, in fact I've really grown to appreciate the circuit as a game mode, but having to leave Duviri twice every spiral to go play different content feels really forced and ruins the flow of running around Duviri. The circuit is uninterrupted Undercroft, so why shouldn't the spirals be uninterrupted Duviri? I think the solution to the problem is already partly enacted in current Duviri. Undercroft stages can remain, but should only be optional side activities. That way, if you feel like a bit of Warframe gameplay, you can play it without it being the way of Drifter gameplay. If Undercroft stages are to remain in spirals, an alternate change could be to design a new game mode, where you survive a 5-minute onslaught of Dax enemies, playing either as the Drifter or your Warframe. It's implied that Thrax's influence is weak in the Undercroft, so free use of either the Drifter or Warframe would be perfect. After all, with the previous changes and improvements, you'd want to keep playing as the Drifter. This next issue is to do with matchmaking and an unnecessary restriction that hurts Duviri gameplay. The Duviri experience and the lone story should not be separate game modes, as it needlessly dilutes matchmaking. Consider this hypothetical. Imagine a lobby with two Drifters. One wants to complete the spiral, get their pathos clamps, and leave as soon as they can. The other is eager to play side activities and just roam Duviri with no urgency. The problem is that these two players can't both get what they want. If the first Drifter enters the Undercroft, initiates phase 2 of the OROWYRM fight, or leaves Duviri, the second player will be pulled with them. Squads aren't necessary for spiral completion. Duviri can be played solo and with ease. It would almost certainly require a large change to code, but all Duviri players could get what they want out of Duviri if the entire squad didn't have to directly participate in any of the main content. If anything, this actually helps cooperation by playing well into Duviri's decree system. Think about it, if the entire squad spent 5 minutes all playing the same Undercroft stage, the reward would be 1 decree. However, if those same 5 minutes had half the squad in the Undercroft and half the squad still in Duviri doing side activities, the reward would be multiple decrees. If a change like this is possible, it should 100% be implemented. For me, the OROWYRM is one of the most disappointing parts of Duviri. That's mostly because it had been advertised as an unstoppable threat that you had to plan around in order to survive in Duviri. Now, the OROWYRM will only appear when you summon it, and will fly around in a circle until you complete the rest of phase 1 of the boss fight. I think the only real solution is simply to have the OROWYRM as it was during the 2022 demo, roaming spontaneously and serving as a reason for the players to stay on the move. I think this is also why Duviri has such an intricate cave system. It was meant to serve as an emergency hiding space when the OROWYRM caught you off guard, which definitely would have added a welcome layer of depth to gameplay, pun not intended. Another thing I was pretty upset about is how self-contained the OROWYRM fight is. What I mean by that is, you fight the OROWYRM outside of playable Duviri, and once you leave the arena, that's the last you see of it. I think when it comes to fighting the OROWYRM, we should be killing it, rather than it simply flying away in an anticlimactic ending. What would make this 100 times better also would be if the OROWYRM was shot down and fell upon Duviri, the area for which the OROWYRM comes from depending on the Courtiers' location. After all, that's what happened in the cinematic trailer, and that was released just 2 weeks before Duviri. This felt pretty misleading, at least to me. Even so, the fights don't at all differentiate between the Courtiers. It's the same animation and same sequence every time. You can only play it so many times before it gets kind of old. This is a flaw in Duviri that I don't think many people have really picked up on, but it does create an awkward friction in the gameplay loop. Being a melee focused game mode, it only makes sense to acquire melee decrees to get stronger throughout the spiral. However, when it comes to completing the spiral by fighting the OROWYRM, your only form of attack are your ranged weapons, which you haven't prioritized because combat has been almost entirely melee up to this point. The reverse also somewhat applies. Acquiring decrees for ranged weapons means you're left with a relatively weak melee weapon. You do have the option of using the Drifter's Sirocco, but you shouldn't be forced into it. Additionally, if you get bad RNG in Teshin's Cave, your ranged Warframe weapons will also be weak. The point is, core parts of the gameplay loop fundamentally call for contradicting builds. You can just get decrees for both ranged and melee combat, but this slows your run down, which is not ideal if you just want to get in and get it done. This isn't too big of an issue, it isn't usually something run-ending, but it's the perfect excuse for some additions to Duviri gameplay that would greatly increase its appeal. There are two additions I have in mind. The first is to incorporate melee combat into the OROWYRM fight. Let's suppose another hypothetical. You begin the OROWYRM fight, which takes place entirely in the playable Duviri area. Once you turn the Pathos valves into place, they become vulnerable to both melee and ranged attack. This gives you two options. The first is to fly and Kaith back alongside the OROWYRM, shooting out the valves with your ranged weapons. The second option would be to climb onto the back of the OROWYRM as it flies and strike the valves up close. Both of these options can be played out as either the Warframe or the Drifter. Expanding on this point, let's talk about ranged combat in Duviri more broadly. If the OROWYRM fight is compatible with ranged combat, it only makes sense that standard Duviri gameplay beforehand is too. This leads me to the next suggestion that I think would greatly improve gameplay. Drifters should be able to wield additional secondaries and primary weapons. Advanced melee combat is a very welcome addition, but both standard Warframe and the New War Drifter prominently feature the use of ranged weapons. Duviri Drifter should too. Not to hark back to the 2019 trailer again, but, you know, Drifter with Tigris. I have a change in mind for this, and it's radical, but I think it could work. When you begin a Duviri Experience mission, you're loaded into Teshin's Cave and are given the choice of your Warframe and weapons, like usual. But here's the thing, both your Drifter and Warframe can wield these weapons. There is no longer a disparity between the Drifter's arsenal and the Warframe's, it's one and the same. All of these weapons are now also affected by decrees. This, alongside the aforementioned changes to the OROWYRM fight, means that there are no arbitrary restrictions as to what decrees to pick. Every decree will boost a part of your fighting force at any time in any context. Your choice truly becomes your own, and is not the choice of the game mode design. As a bonus, your melee weapon can now also be used by the Drifter to perform power strikes. Maybe power strikes should be in standard Warframe too, that'd be cool. Overall, this also opens up the opportunity to add more range enemies into Duviri, enriching gameplay and the number of possible playstyles available. With an expanded combat system that makes decrees and the Drifter even more effective, it's only right that Duviri decks receive a buff too. They are far too weak to begin with. By the end of a spiral, 2 heavy attacks are enough to kill an entire group of max level decks, even in Steel Path. This also contributes to Duviri being an unengaging game mode. If all combat encounters are over at the click of 2 buttons, where's the fun? A simple fix for this would be to increase decks' health and damage. Giving them a bit of armor too could also help to make them stronger, and provides a better use case for corrosive decrees. Steel Path is meant to be challenging, and this, alongside previous suggested changes, would help it to be so. That being said, normal difficulty Duviri would also greatly benefit from this buff. Next, I want to talk about Duviri's visual identity. This issue doesn't really hurt Duviri all that much, but it's one I really want to include. I noticed that the overall colour in Duviri had been increased since earlier versions. When the spiral begins, about 30% of the colour is already visible. It's not much, but it's enough that the colourlessness feel becomes a lot less pronounced and makes for a much less interesting contrast at the end of the spiral when Duviri has full colour. I think a better way to illustrate Duviri's colour transformation would be to once again begin at 0 colour, with about 20% of the colour becoming visible upon completion of a spiral stage. Not only would this make the completion of the spiral actually feel more impactful, but it'd allow the colour from the Guiding Hand, Kaith and Drifter to stand out more. That's just about everything I have to say about Duviri's gameplay. There is still a lack of polish, a concerning number of bugs.
What the hell? Oh my God, no.
As well as some other opportunities that should have been realised, but I just wanted to talk about the issues I felt were significant. Let's talk a little bit about the story and the lore of Duviri, mainly about its pitfalls. The first that I want to talk about is Dominus Thrax. The biggest issue with the Dominus is that he's hardly present at all in the Duviri gameplay loop. He'll occasionally have a snarky one-liner when you complete a spiral stage, but this doesn't even seem to happen all the time. The only time you can guarantee seeing him is at the end of the spiral after defeating the OROWYRM. Considering Thrax is the main antagonist of Duviri, I feel like he should be way more involved. Perhaps he could have more dialogue both throughout and at the end of the spiral. Another idea is overhauling the extraction sequence so that it ends in a confrontation where we once again assume the throne and reset the spiral ourselves. It'd at least directly illustrate how the spiral actually resets on subsequent Duviri missions. My next point still somewhat relates to Thrax, but it makes more sense to discuss it here. The 5 Duviri Courtiers dominate their respective spirals, acting as your mission guide before eventually transforming into the OROWYRM that you fight at the end. This is likely just my opinion, but while these Courtiers are fun and interesting characters, the role they play could have been better executed. Firstly, I was never really fond of the idea that they transform into OROWYRMs. I much prefer the idea that there is one single OROWYRM who persists through all spirals, is their own individual character, and answers only to Thrax. I understand that the Courtiers' transformations represent the loss of emotional control, which plays into Duviri's theme. It's a cool concept, but I really do believe that this should have been portrayed through Thrax and Duviri itself only. After all, Thrax is a child king. It makes sense that he's the one prone to emotional outbursts rather than his adult courtiers. Again, this did seem to be the case in the 2022 demo, but obviously not anymore. Perhaps the Courtiers could act solely as mission guides, assisting the Drifter in navigating and completing the spiral. Not only this, but I feel like the Courtiers themselves have almost been standardized. Lucinia would comfort Thrax, Loden was the executioner, and Bombastine was an eccentric playwright. They were their own distinct characters that you could meet and actually interact with in the world of Duviri. This was mentioned in an interview with Rebecca about Duviri before its launch. I'll put the link to that interview in the description. It seems that this was another case of cut content. Now, they feel kind of samey, with the difference just being their dialogue as they talk to the player throughout the spiral. On to my next point, and this is definitely a nitpick, but why does Euleria Entrati narrate the Duviri spirals? I know that she wrote the guidebook that Duviri was brought to life from, but it adds almost nothing to the experience. By the end of the spiral, you've got 4 characters speaking, which is just excessive. Also, I feel like having a non-diegetic narrator just takes away from Duviri's immersion, and the whole theme that it's a fantasy world actually brought to real life. So, I don't think her narration should be in Duviri. Next, we're going to talk about what is probably my biggest complaint about Duviri's overall lore, and it's definitely not a nitpick. What actually is the Duviri Paradox? I don't mean the expansion itself, but the actual paradox in the narrative. Well, after a lot of thought and investigation, I've arrived at the answer. There is none. There is no Duviri Paradox. They should have just called it the Duviri. Okay, but seriously no, there is no paradox. I've looked at all the aspects of the story, and none of them suggest anything of the nature. If anyone actually has an idea, please leave a comment. I do actually want to know in case there is one. Teshin will mention it occasionally in the Undercroft and during the quest, but he uses the word as if the paradox is some sort of physical object, which can't be the case. That being said, I have an idea of what the Duviri Paradox might have been, and the clues lie in the original 2019 trailer. After using a Tigris planted by the operator to save themselves, the drifter heads towards a Zariman, which is presumably stuck in Duviri. My theory is that this trailer alluded to a sort of circular paradox, where the operator helping the drifter allowed the drifter to save the operator, thus allowing the operator to help the drifter, so on and so forth. It might not be an accurate theory, but it's my best guess. Again, if you have any theories, please share them, I'd love to discuss them. So, with all of these changes and suggestions in mind, what would Duviri actually look like? Would it be good to play? Well, we can't say for sure if it'd be any good to play, we'd actually have to play it. But let's just imagine what playing Duviri would be like. You start a spiral, it's joy. You take Excalibur, the Corinth, the Lex, and the Gram. As you walk through the portal, the drifter is wielding those same 3 weapons. Duviri is completely colourless. You find Mathila, who will assist you in navigating Thrax's joy. The first spiral stage is to defeat the mounted Dax. It's a fair distance away, so you ride at a full speed gallop to the objective. The fight begins, and you want to keep your distance. You use your Corinth and Lex to deal damage, performing melee finishes as each bar depletes. With the Dax off their cave, you decide to dismount yours and finish the fight up close. With 3 heavy attacks, the Dax is almost dead, so you play defensively and charge your power strike bar. Since you are using the Gram, you unleash a heavier blade power strike, delivering the final blow. The next stage is in the Undercroft. You go in, but your one other teammate is keen to explore Courtiers' hold, so they stay back. While you're there, your teammate defeats Courtiers and completes a mirror puzzle, giving you 2 extra decrees while you're still in the Undercroft. The spiral continues, and you use a mix of ranged, melee, and Kaith-back attacks to take down the Dax and restore Duviri's colour. You also vary your approaches to combat, sometimes going in guns blazing, other times picking enemies off one by one with them being none the wiser. With the spiral complete and Thrax feeling overwhelmingly joyous, it's time to fight and kill his OROWYRM. Your teammate insists they want to fight it by themselves, so you watch on from the ground. They turn the valves, opening them for damage and beginning phase 2. Having built for range, they decide to return to their Kaith and shoot the valves out from a distance. While on Kaithback, they activate Mace's shooting gallery, boosting their damage, and finally shoot the OROWYRM out of the sky! With the OROWYRM dead, you confront Thrax at his palace, assume the throne, and reset the spiral once more.
Mine is mine.
You can have it.
Concluding the video, I think that I've proved my point that Duviri is certainly flawed. The quest is underwhelming, the gameplay is shallow, and it's way too easy to poke holes in the lore. Something being flawed doesn't necessarily mean that it's bad though. Duviri isn't bad, but it isn't good either. It's just average. I think the main reason Duviri was shipped in the state that it was is partially a matter of time constraints. I've heard some people say that Duviri should have been better because it had 4 years of development, which is 100% not true. I can assure you that they were not working on Duviri while they were working on the New War, or Angels of the Zariman. Hell, half of DE had been working on Warframe for God knows how long. Duviri had a solid year of development, maybe 2. Everything I've discussed in this video is proof of that. Even then, the time that they had was still not enough, considering how many times it got delayed. Time constraints for one force working against DE, but I think another was an unclear creative vision. Duviri was conceptualized under Steve's lead, but because he moved to Warframe development, it was left in Rebecca's hands. This isn't to say that the current Souls roguelite Duviri is bad, I love the decree system, but in retrospect, a melee focus seemed like somewhat of an arbitrary decision. The missing elements of standard Warframe melee hurt this even more. The purpose of this video isn't to bash Duviri or DE, but to reignite interest and discussion. It makes no sense anyway. I've been playing the game for years, have thousands of hours, and am LR2. I think Warframe is an incredible game, led by incredible developers who actually give a shit. So it broke my heart to see them under-deliver on the expansion I've been excited for more than anything in my whole gaming career. Given the time and resources that were available to the devs, I'd say they did a damn good job. But there's still so much that leaves me wanting more. If you care to see Duviri be revisited by the developers, please like and share this video. If any game studio were to breathe significant life back into an old DLC, it'd certainly be Digital Extremes. Who knows, maybe a developer will see this video. or maybe no one will, and that's kind of okay too. Making this video helped me to stop being frustrated at the reality of Duviri and the circumstances that led it here. If you have any ideas for how Duviri could be improved, let's discuss it in the comments. I only ask that you're civil and respectful. Before I finish, I'd like to shout out these amazing Warframe creators, who have inspired me in both making this video and as a content creator in general. With that, thank you very much for watching, and until next time.